The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine sat in the drawing room, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. The ornate clock on the mantelpiece showed 3:30 in the afternoon, and the grey London sky made it feel much later. She had been staring at the same page of her book for 20 minutes, her mind elsewhere entirely. The children were at school, and William was attending a series of meetings at Buckingham Palace. The quiet of the apartment felt unusually heavy today, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible weight. Recent weeks had been particularly challenging, with mounting pressures from royal duties, endless scrutiny from the media, and the constant balancing act between being a mother, a wife, and a future queen. Catherine set down her teacup with trembling fingers. The porcelain clinked softly against the saucer, the only sound breaking the silence. She had been holding back tears all morning, fighting the overwhelming feeling that everything was becoming too much to handle. The facade of perfection that royal life demanded felt more suffocating than ever. She walked to the large window overlooking the palace gardens, watching the rain create rivulets down the glass. The bare branches of the oak trees swayed in the wind, stripped of their autumn glory. Everything looked as gray and heavy as she felt inside. The weight of expectations, the endless public appearances, and the pressure to always appear composed and graceful were taking their toll. The sound of a key turning in the front door made her heart skip. William wasn't supposed to be back for hours. She quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and straightened her posture, automatically switching into the composed demeanor that had become second nature. But as she heard his familiar footsteps in the hallway, growing closer to the drawing room, something inside her began to crack. Catherine turned toward the door, preparing her usual bright smile, the one she wore for photographers and public events. But when the door handle turned and William stepped into the room, that carefully constructed mask began to slip. His presence, so familiar and comforting, made all the emotions she had been suppressing throughout the day rise to the surface. William paused in the doorway, his hand still on the handle. He had come home early from his meetings, sensing something was amiss. Perhaps it was the brief phone call they had shared earlier, where Catherine's voice had sounded strained despite her cheerful words. Or maybe it was the intuition that comes from years of marriage and truly knowing someone. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, Catherine felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. The tears she had been holding back all day threatened to spill over. She stood frozen by the window, unable to speak, unable to move, her emotions written clearly across her face despite her attempts to hide them. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. William could see immediately that his wife was struggling, that beneath her polished exterior she was fighting a battle he couldn't see but could certainly feel. The way she stood, slightly hunched as if protecting herself, the tension in her shoulders, and most tellingly, the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Without saying a word, William stepped fully into the room and gently closed the door behind him. The soft click of the latch seemed to break something open in Catherine. The safe space his presence created, the knowledge that she could let her guard down with him, made the dam of emotions she had been holding back finally burst. The tears began to fall before Catherine could stop them, first one, then another, until they flowed freely down her cheeks. She didn't sob or cry out loud. Instead, she stood perfectly still by the window, her shoulders barely moving as silent tears traced paths down her face. The composed duchess that the world knew and admired was nowhere to be found in this moment. William watched his wife with growing concern. He had seen Catherine handle countless difficult situations with grace and strength. She had faced hostile media coverage, family crises, and the immense pressure of royal life with remarkable composure. But standing before him now was not the poised public figure the world knew. This was his wife, vulnerable and hurting, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of everything she carried. The silence in the room was profound. No words were exchanged, yet the communication between them was deeper than any conversation they had ever had. Catherine's tears spoke of exhaustion, of the crushing weight of perfection expected from her every day, of the loneliness that could exist even in the most public of lives. Each tear represented a moment when she had smiled when she wanted to cry, when she had been strong when she felt weak. William understood immediately that this wasn't about any single incident or event. This was about the accumulation of months, perhaps years, of pressure. The constant scrutiny of their marriage, their parenting, their every public appearance, the way the media analyzed her clothing choices, her facial expressions, even how she held her children's hands. The pressure to be perfect not just for herself, but for the institution of the monarchy, for the British people, for history itself. As he watched her, William felt his own emotions surge. Guilt washed over him as he realized how much Catherine had been carrying alone. He had been so focused on his own royal duties, his own pressures and responsibilities, that he hadn't fully grasped how deeply the strain was affecting his wife. The woman who supported him through everything, who made his demanding life possible, was drowning in the very life they shared. Catherine's tears continued to fall, but she made no move to wipe them away. There was something liberating about finally letting them flow, about not fighting to maintain the perfect image for once. In this private moment in their home, with the person who knew her best, she could finally be human. She could finally acknowledge that she was struggling, that the fairy tale the world saw wasn't always how it felt from the inside. The rain outside seemed to mirror her emotional release, steady and persistent. The gray afternoon light filtering through the windows cast everything in soft shadows, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt separate from the outside world. Here in this moment there were no cameras, no protocol officers, no crowds of people watching their every move. There was just a husband and wife and the raw honesty of pain being acknowledged. William took a tentative step forward, his heart breaking for the woman he loved. He could see the exhaustion in every line of her body, the way she held herself as if she might collapse at any moment. The strong, graceful woman who charmed world leaders and comforted grieving families was showing him her deepest vulnerability, and he felt honored and heartbroken in equal measure. The clock continued to tick, marking the passage of time, but neither of them seemed aware of it. This moment existed outside of schedules and obligations. It was a moment of truth, of raw emotion, of a marriage tested by extraordinary circumstances. Catherine's silent tears were saying everything that words couldn't express about the cost of living their very public life. As William stood there, uncertain whether to speak or move closer, he realized that sometimes the most powerful moments between people happen in complete silence. Catherine's tears were telling him a story he had perhaps been too busy to fully hear before, and he was finally listening with his whole heart. William remained motionless, allowing Catherine the space she needed to release the emotions she had been holding inside. He understood instinctively that rushing to comfort her might interrupt something important that was happening. This wasn't a moment for quick fixes or reassuring words. This was a moment for witnessing, for being present while his wife finally allowed herself to feel everything she had been pushing down. Catherine's breathing was shallow and uneven, but she wasn't making any sound beyond the soft intake of breath between tears. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, no longer attempting to maintain any pretense of being in control. The woman who could command a room full of dignitaries, who could soothe crying children at hospital visits, who could deliver speeches with perfect composure, stood before him completely undone. The weight of understanding settled on William's shoulders. He began to see their life through Catherine's eyes in a way he never had before. While he had been born into this world of protocol and public scrutiny, she had chosen it when she chose him. She had given up the possibility of a private life, of making mistakes without global consequences, of raising their children away from the constant glare of public attention. Every decision Catherine made was scrutinized and judged. The way she disciplined their children in public, her choice of clothing for state dinners, even her facial expressions during boring ceremonial events were analyzed by millions of people. She couldn't have a bad day, couldn't be tired or frustrated or simply human without it becoming news. The pressure to be perpetually gracious, interested, and perfect was something William had grown up with, but Catherine had adopted it out of love for him. As he watched her tears continue to fall, William thought about all the times Catherine had stood by his side, smiling brilliantly while he knew she must have been exhausted. All the times she had charmed difficult guests at state functions, all the hospital visits where she had brought comfort to families in crisis, all the public appearances where she had represented the royal family with dignity and warmth. She had never complained, never showed the strain publicly. The rain outside was beginning to ease, but the emotional storm inside their drawing room was far from over. Catherine's tears seemed to have opened a floodgate of everything she had been suppressing. Years of putting duty before personal feelings, of being constantly watched and judged. of trying to be worthy of the role she had inherited through marriage rather than birth. William felt a profound shift in his understanding of their partnership. He had always known Catherine was strong, but he was beginning to realize that her strength had been protecting him from seeing just how much their life was costing her. She had shouldered burdens he hadn't even known she was carrying, maintaining the illusion that their extraordinary life was manageable and sustainable. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the room. Still, Catherine stood by the window, tears flowing silently down her cheeks. There was something almost beautiful about her vulnerability in this moment. The way she had finally allowed herself to be completely authentic. The polished perfection was gone, replaced by raw human emotion that was far more powerful than any public appearance. William realized that this moment was changing something fundamental between them. Not just his understanding of what Catherine was experiencing, but his appreciation for the sacrifices she had made and continued to make. Every smile she had given when she was tired, every gracious response to criticism, every time she had put the needs of the monarchy before her own comfort had been an act of love, not just for him but for the institution they served together. The silence continued, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It had become a sacred space where truth could exist without the need for explanation or justification. Catherine's tears were washing away years of pretense, creating room for a deeper honesty between them. William knew that when this moment passed, their relationship would be different, deeper, more real than it had ever been before. As he stood there, William made a silent promise to himself and to his wife. He would never again allow Catherine to carry so much alone. He would pay better attention to the signs, would create more spaces where she could be human, rather than perfect, would protect her not just from external threats but from the internal pressure to be everything to everyone all the time. Slowly, carefully, William began to move across the room toward his wife. Each step was deliberate and gentle, as if he were approaching a wounded bird that might startle and fly away. He didn't want to break the sacred space that Catherine's vulnerability had created, but he also couldn't stand to watch her pain from a distance any longer. Catherine was aware of his movement but didn't turn toward him. Her gaze remained fixed on the garden outside, though she wasn't really seeing the wet grass or the dripping trees. Her tears had slowed slightly, but they continued to fall in a steady stream down her cheeks. The release felt both devastating and cleansing, like a fever finally breaking after a long illness. When William was close enough to touch her, he paused again. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself as if she might shatter at any moment. The afternoon light caught the tears on her face, making them sparkle like diamonds against her skin. She looked ethereal and heartbroken at the same time, beautiful in her complete honesty. Very gently, William reached out and placed his hand on Catherine's shoulder. The touch was light, barely there, but it conveyed everything he couldn't say in words. His palm was warm against the cool silk of her blouse, and Catherine felt the gesture like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. She didn't move away from his touch, but she didn't lean into it either. She was still too raw, too exposed to accept comfort easily. The contact between them seemed to intensify Catherine's emotions rather than calm them. Fresh tears spilled over, and for the first time since William had entered the room, she made a sound. It was barely audible, just a soft intake of breath that spoke of years of suppressed pain finally finding voice. The sound went straight to William's heart, confirming what he had suspected about the depth of her struggle. William's thumb moved gently against Catherine's shoulder, a small gesture of comfort and connection. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to hold her until the pain passed, but something told him that she needed to feel this fully before she could accept comfort. She needed to experience the release that came from finally allowing herself to be vulnerable. Through the window, the garden was beginning to emerge from the afternoon rain. Drops of water clung to the rose bushes, and the last of the autumn flowers looked refreshed and renewed. The sight seemed symbolic somehow, as if nature itself was demonstrating that beauty could emerge from the storm. Catherine's emotional cleansing felt similar, necessary and ultimately healing. As William stood beside his wife, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, he found himself thinking about their wedding day. He remembered how radiant Catherine had looked, how confident and happy she had seemed as they promised to face whatever came together. At the time, he didn't think either of them fully understood what whatever came would actually mean. The relentless scrutiny, the impossible standards, the way their private moments would become public property. Catherine's breathing began to slow and deepen. The storm of tears was beginning to subside, leaving behind a profound exhaustion but also a sense of relief. She had been carrying this emotional burden for so long that she had forgotten how heavy it was until she finally set it down. The feeling was like removing a piece of clothing that had been too tight, suddenly being able to breathe freely again. William could sense the shift in his wife's emotional state. The desperate quality of her tears was giving way to something calmer, though no less profound. He continued to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring without being overwhelming. He was learning that sometimes the most loving thing he could do was simply be there, to witness her pain without trying to fix it immediately. The room around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls understood the significance of what was happening. This wasn't just a moment of emotional release for Catherine. It was a turning point in their marriage. The perfect facade they had both worked so hard to maintain was cracking open, revealing the real people underneath. And contrary to what they might have feared, the reality was not weaker than the facade. It was stronger, more honest, more capable of withstanding the pressures they faced. As the minutes passed, Catherine began to feel William's presence more acutely. His hand on her shoulder was an anchor, keeping her grounded while she processed emotions that had been building for months. She wasn't ready to speak yet, wasn't ready to explain or analyze what she was feeling, but she was beginning to be ready to accept comfort. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Catherine turned slightly toward William. Her face was streaked with tears, her usually perfect makeup smudged and her eyes red from crying. But there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a kind of openness that made her more beautiful than any photographer had ever captured. William's heart clenched at the sight of his wife's tear-stained face. Without makeup and pretense, with her guard completely down, Catherine looked younger somehow, more like the woman he had fallen in love with at university. The polished Duchess had disappeared, leaving behind someone infinitely more precious. His Kate, vulnerable and real and trusting him with her deepest pain. Catherine's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. How could she explain the crushing weight of always having to be perfect? How could she describe the loneliness of being constantly surrounded by people, but never able to truly be herself? How could she make him understand that sometimes the life they shared felt more like a beautiful prison than a fairy tale? William seemed to understand her struggle to find words. He moved his hand from her shoulder to gently cup her face, his thumb wiping away fresh tears as they fell. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, that it nearly broke Catherine's composure all over again. Here was the man she had married, not the prince or the future king, but William, who loved her enough to see her pain and not be frightened by it. The touch of his hand against her cheek seemed to give Catherine permission to finally lean into him. She moved closer, not quite ready for a full embrace, but close enough that she could feel his warmth and strength. William stood perfectly still, letting her choose how much comfort she was ready to accept. He understood that this was her moment, her healing, and he was honored to be trusted with it. As Catherine stood there, feeling William's solid presence beside her, she began to realize something important. She had been so afraid that showing her struggles would make her appear weak, would disappoint him or make him think less of her. But looking into his eyes now, she saw only love and concern. There was no judgment, no disappointment, only a deep desire to understand and help. The late afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds outside, sending shafts of golden light across the drawing room floor. The change in lighting seemed to mirror the shift happening between them. The gray heaviness of the earlier rain was giving way to something brighter, more hopeful. Catherine's emotional storm was similarly beginning to clear, leaving room for something new to grow. William could see that Catherine was beginning to emerge from the depths of her despair. Her breathing was more even now, her tears flowing less freely, but he also knew that this was just the beginning of a conversation they needed to have, not the end. This moment of breakdown was actually a breakthrough, an opportunity for them to rebuild their partnership on more honest foundations. Gradually, Catherine found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, the words carrying far more weight than a simple apology. She was sorry for hiding her struggles, sorry for pretending everything was fine when it wasn't, sorry for not trusting their marriage enough to be honest about her pain. William shook his head gently, his hand still cupping her face. "No," he said quietly, his voice firm despite its softness. "Don't apologize for being human. Don't apologize for feeling." His words carried the weight of absolute acceptance of unconditional love that didn't require perfection. He was telling her that her struggles didn't make her weak or inadequate. They made her real. The simple exchange seemed to unlock something in Catherine. The last of her resistance crumbled, and she finally allowed herself to step fully into William's arms. He folded her against his chest, holding her with a tenderness that spoke of years of love and commitment. She fit against him perfectly, as she always had, but this embrace felt different from any they had shared before. Catherine's tears began again, but they were different now. These weren't the desperate tears of someone drowning in isolation. These were tears of relief, of finally being seen and accepted in her entirety. She pressed her face against William's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, allowing herself to be completely vulnerable with the person who mattered most. For the first time in months, Catherine felt truly safe. Not the public safety of protocol and security details, but the personal safety of being known and loved, despite her flaws and fears. In William's arms, she didn't have to be perfect or strong or gracious. She could just be herself, wounded and healing and human. William held Catherine close, feeling the tension slowly leave her body as she allowed herself to accept his comfort. He could feel her tears soaking through his shirt, but he didn't care about anything except being there for his wife in this moment when she needed him most. His arms tightened around her protectively, as if he could shield her from all the pressures and expectations that had brought her to this breaking point. As they stood together in the golden afternoon light, Catherine began to speak in halting whispers against William's shoulder. The words came slowly at first, then faster as months of suppressed feelings finally found their voice. She told him about the sleepless nights when she lay awake worrying about whether she was doing enough, being enough, representing their family and country well enough. She spoke about the weight of every public appearance, how she second-guessed every word, every gesture, every smile. She described the exhaustion of being constantly photographed, of knowing that any moment of human imperfection would be captured and analyzed by millions of strangers, the fear that she would somehow fail him, fail their children, fail the institution she had married into. William listened to every word, his heart breaking with each revelation. He had been so focused on his own role and responsibilities that he hadn't fully grasped how differently Catherine experienced their shared life. While he had grown up knowing what was expected of him, she had learned it all as an adult, transforming herself from a private person into a public figure for love of him. Catherine talked about the loneliness of their life, how even surrounded by staff and officials and crowds of people, she often felt isolated, the way protocol created distance between them and others, how genuine connections became nearly impossible when every interaction was carefully managed and observed. She missed the spontaneity of her old life, the ability to make friends without wondering about their motives. The words poured out of Catherine like water from a broken dam. She told William about her fears for their children, how she worried about the pressure and scrutiny they would face as they grew older. She wanted to protect them from the worst aspects of royal life, while still preparing them for their roles. The balance felt impossible some days, and she questioned whether she was strong enough to guide them through what lay ahead. William felt overwhelmed by the depth of Catherine's struggles, and by his own failure to see them clearly before now. He realized that while he had been dealing with his own pressures, he had unconsciously expected Catherine to handle hers with the same grace she brought to everything else. He hadn't created enough space for her to be anything less than perfect. Even in private, as Catherine continued to speak, her voice growing stronger with each admission, William began to understand something crucial. This breakdown wasn't a sign of weakness or failure. It was actually a sign of incredible strength. For months, perhaps years, Catherine had been carrying burdens that would have crushed most people, and she had done it with such skill that even he hadn't fully realized the cost. The late afternoon light continued to stream through the windows, warming the room and casting everything in a soft, forgiving glow. The storm outside had completely passed, leaving the garden fresh and clean. Similarly, the emotional storm that had overwhelmed Catherine was beginning to clear, leaving space for healing and renewal. When Catherine finally fell silent, they remained in each other's arms for several more minutes. The silence was comfortable now, filled with understanding rather than pain. William could feel a fundamental shift in their relationship, as if they had crossed some invisible bridge into deeper intimacy and trust. The perfect facade was gone, but what remained was infinitely more valuable. Slowly, gently, William pulled back slightly so he could look into Catherine's eyes. Her face was still streaked with tears, but there was something different in her expression now. The desperate quality was gone, replaced by a quiet exhaustion but also a sense of relief. She had finally shared the burden she had been carrying alone, and it had not destroyed their marriage or diminished his love for her. William brushed the remaining tears from Catherine's cheeks with his thumbs, looking directly into her eyes as he spoke. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried enormous weight. He was thanking her not just for finally sharing her struggles, but for everything she had sacrificed for their life together. For every smile when she was tired, every gracious response to criticism, every time she had put duty before her own needs. Catherine searched his face, looking for any sign of disappointment or judgment, but finding only love and admiration. She had been so afraid that her struggles would make him think less of her. But instead she saw a new respect in his eyes. He was seeing her fully for the first time, understanding the strength that had taken to carry so much for so long. In the days that followed that transformative afternoon, everything between William and Catherine began to change. The conversation that started with tears and silence continued over morning coffee, during evening walks in the palace gardens, and in quiet moments after the children were asleep. For the first time in their marriage, they were completely honest about the cost of their extraordinary life. William made immediate changes to his schedule, turning down some engagements and rearranging others to create more time for his family. He began to pay attention to signs he had missed before, watching for the subtle indicators that Catherine was struggling. More importantly, he created regular opportunities for her to be honest about her feelings without fear of judgment or the pressure to seem grateful for their privileged life. Catherine, for her part, began to understand that vulnerability was not weakness. The breakdown that had terrified her actually strengthened their marriage in ways she hadn't expected. William's response to her pain showed her that their love was strong enough to handle truth, even when that truth was difficult or imperfect. She began to share her struggles more openly before they built up to crisis levels. They instituted new traditions in their household, small but significant changes that prioritized their emotional well-being alongside their public duties. Every Sunday evening became family time, with no official engagements and no staff except for essential security. They established a signal system so Catherine could communicate to William when she was struggling during public events, allowing him to provide subtle support without drawing attention. Most importantly, they began to redefine what success looked like in their role as royals. Instead of focusing solely on public perception and flawless execution of duties, they started measuring their effectiveness by how well they maintained their family's emotional health and genuine connection to each other. They realized that a strong, honest marriage would ultimately serve the monarchy better than a perfect facade. The media and public noticed subtle changes in the royal couple over the following months. Their interactions seemed more natural, more genuinely affectionate. Catherine appeared more relaxed during public appearances, and when she did show signs of tiredness or stress, it somehow made her more relatable rather than less impressive. The public began to see them as real people facing real challenges, which actually increased rather than decreased their popularity. Catherine learned to set boundaries in ways she never had before. She began saying no to certain requests and engagements when her emotional reserves were low. She started working with a therapist who specialized in helping people in high-pressure public roles, something she had been too proud to consider before her breakdown. The therapy helped her develop coping strategies and gave her tools for managing the unique stresses of royal life. William, meanwhile, became a more protective partner. He began running interference when protocol officials made unreasonable demands on Catherine's time or energy. He made it clear to palace staff that his wife's well-being was not negotiable, even when it meant disappointing people who expected unlimited access to their time and attention. His protective instincts, awakened by seeing Catherine's pain, made him a stronger leader and a better husband. The children, too young to understand the details of what had happened, nonetheless benefited from the emotional honesty their parents brought to family life. Catherine and William made deliberate choices about how to raise their children differently, ensuring they would have more emotional support and understanding of the pressures they would face. They began having age-appropriate conversations about the challenges and responsibilities of royal life, preparing their children gradually rather than expecting them to simply adapt. A year later, Catherine would look back on that rainy afternoon as the day her real life began. Not the fairy tale version that the world wanted to see, but the authentic, sometimes difficult, ultimately more satisfying life that came from being known and accepted completely. The tears she had been so ashamed of became the foundation for a stronger, more honest partnership with William. The couple learned that perfection was not only impossible, but unnecessary. Their struggles and vulnerabilities, when handled with honesty and mutual support, actually made them more effective in their roles. People connected with their humanity, and their genuine care for each other became a source of inspiration rather than the flawless performance they had previously tried to maintain. That moment when William opened the door to find Catherine in tears marked the end of one chapter of their marriage and the beginning of another. It was the day they stopped pretending to be perfect and started learning to be real, together. And in that reality, they found something far more valuable than any fairy tale. A love strong enough to hold both joy and sorrow, success and struggle, the public crown and the private heart.